America has more than 340 million people, packed metros, endless suburbs, and traffic jams that can turn a 15-minute drive into a personal crisis. Zoom out, though, and the country starts looking very different. Far from the biggest urban corridors, huge parts of the U.S. are still barely filled in. We're talking about entire states, some larger than many countries, where the population is smaller than a single major metro area. These places aren't lifeless. They have towns, industries, farms, mines, military bases, tourist economies, and people who'd rather keep the open land than swap it for apartment towers. But when the land is that big and the population is that thin, human settlement starts to look scattered. So why are these states still so empty? Why does one keep nearly 89% of its residents in just 2 counties? Why does another attract newcomers and still remain one of the sparsest places in America? It may come down to water, rough terrain, huge stretches of public land, ranch country, or the simple fact that the next town is often very far away. And sometimes the land is already doing exactly what people need it to do, without being covered in subdivisions. Today, we're counting down the 10 emptiest states in America. Number 10. Kansas. Kansas probably isn't the first state people picture when they hear empty America. It isn't frozen at the edge of the continent, boxed in by mountains, or dry enough that every new neighborhood has to start a negotiation with the water supply. It sits right in the middle of the country, which is exactly why its emptiness is easy to miss. In 2025, Kansas had an estimated population of 2,977,220 people spread across 81,758.59 square miles of land. That works out to about 36.4 people per square mile, sparse enough to place it at number 10. The state's population leans heavily east. Wichita, Topeka, Lawrence, and the Kansas City metro area carry much of the urban growth, employment, healthcare, and higher education. Head west and Kansas starts thinning out fast. The towns get smaller, the drives get longer, and grain elevators begin to stand out because almost nothing else nearby is tall enough to challenge them. Wallace County in western Kansas had an estimated 1,441 residents in 2025 across nearly 914 square miles. That is fewer people than many high schools, spread across an area larger than some small metropolitan districts. Kansas has valuable land. The catch is that valuable land does not always require a lot of residents. Much of western Kansas is built around large-scale agriculture, and modern farming runs on acreage, machinery, storage, irrigation, and logistics far more than dense settlement. Huge fields can generate serious economic output without creating a thick chain of towns around them. That is why western Kansas can remain useful, productive, and still look remarkably open from the road. The population has also been concentrating around stronger urban counties. From 2010 to 2020, the share of Kansans living in urban counties rose from 54.9% to 57.3%. Meanwhile, 82 of the state's 105 counties lost population between 2000 and 2016. Rural Kansas did not disappear, but a growing share of people, jobs, and services has been drifting toward the places that already had more of them. Drive across western Kansas, and you can see the pattern without needing a chart. Fields roll past the windshield, a grain elevator rises above a small town, a water tower comes into view, maybe a diner if the town is having a decent day, and then the open land takes over again. Kansas makes this list, but because much of it works on a land-heavy, people-light model. A lot is happening out there. It just does not show up as population density. Number 9. Nevada. Nevada feels like it should be disqualified from a list about empty states because it has Las Vegas. Crowds, casinos, hotel towers, convention centers, endless neighborhoods, and enough digital signage to make nighttime feel optional. But Nevada only looks crowded when you confuse Vegas with the entire state. In 2025, Nevada had an estimated population of 3,282,188 people across 109,860.46 square miles of land. That gives it a density of just 29.9 people per square mile. The state stays sparse because its population is packed into a very small number of places. Clark County, home to Las Vegas, had about 2,407,226 residents in 2025. Washoe County, home to Reno and Sparks, had another 509,386. Together, those two counties held roughly 88.9% of Nevada's population. So most Nevadans live in a couple of major clusters, while the rest of the state stretches out around them in a very different way. Leave the towers and subdivisions behind, and Nevada opens up quickly. The landscape shifts into desert basins, mountain ridges, mining country, military land, and highways where the next settlement can feel less like a destination and more like a rumor. Esmeralda County shows that contrast perfectly. It covers more than 3,581 square miles and had about 729 residents in 2025. That is fewer people than a busy Las Vegas hotel can hold on a decent weekend. Nevada's climate explains part of the pattern. It is the driest state in the country, with average statewide precipitation of about 10.3 inches a year. Desert land can support mines, solar projects, ranching, military uses, tourism, and wide-open recreation. What it does not casually support is dense settlement without a serious plan for water. Land ownership matters too. The Bureau of Land Management manages about 48 million acres of public land in Nevada, roughly 63% of the state. That leaves an enormous share of the map outside the usual private development pipeline. Some of it is managed for conservation, grazing, energy, recreation, or mineral use. Some of it simply sits too far from the places where large-scale settlement makes sense. That is how Nevada ends up looking so contradictory. One piece of the state is crowded, flashy, and globally recognizable. Most of the rest is dry, public, and lightly populated enough to feel like a completely different version of the country. You can spend the morning surrounded by tourists in Las Vegas and be on a highway by afternoon, where the silence starts doing most of the talking. Nevada is not empty where people expect it to be busy. It is sparse almost everywhere else. Number 8. Nebraska. Nebraska has real cities, real employment centers, and much more going on in the East than its reputation usually gets credit for. Omaha matters. Lincoln matters. But Nebraska does not stop at Omaha and Lincoln. In 2025, the state had an estimated population of 2,018,006 people across 76,817.87 square miles of land. That gives it a density of about 26.3 people per square mile. The eastern side carries much of the population, while the center and west spread out with very little hesitation. Cherry County is the clearest example. It covers nearly 5,960 square miles, making it larger than the entire state of Connecticut. Its population density in 2020 was only about 0.9 people per square mile. At that point, low density stops sounding like a statistic and starts sounding like a lifestyle. The Sandhills explain much of that thinness. This huge region of grass-stabilized sand dunes dominates north-central Nebraska and supports some of the best ranching land in the country. Ranching thrives on distance and acreage. It does not require dense neighborhoods, office parks every few miles, or a packed downtown to function. That is why a region can be economically important and still look almost untouched from the road. Nebraska's population pattern has also been moving in the same direction for years. Between 2010 and 2020, 68 of the state's 93 counties lost population. Meanwhile, Omaha and Lincoln kept attracting more jobs, hospitals, universities, offices, and younger residents looking for more options. The result is a state that becomes more lopsided over time. The East gathers more of the growth. The interior and western counties remain broad, productive, and thinly settled. You can see it on a drive through central Nebraska. A gas station appears, then a grain elevator, then cattle, fencing, and long stretches of land that seem perfectly content not to hurry up for anybody. Nebraska is not sparse because it lacks purpose. Much of its interior is built around ranching, range, and distance rather than dense settlement. That is why a state with major cities still lands at number 8. Once you get beyond Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska starts feeling very open very quickly. Number 7, Idaho. Idaho is the odd one on this list because it has been gaining people fast. Longtime residents have watched new rooftops go up, traffic get worse, and enough out-of-state moving vans arrive to keep grocery store conversations lively. In 2025, Idaho's population reached 2,009,733. Its land area is 82,645.4 square miles. Even after years of fast growth, its density stood at only 24.6 people per square mile. That keeps Idaho comfortably inside the top 10. The growth is real. Net migration accounted for 76% of Idaho's population increase in 2025, equal to 22,063 people. And 90% of that net migration came from within the United States. People are absolutely moving to Idaho. They are just spreading across it evenly. Much of the growth flows into Boise, the Treasure Valley, and a few other accessible corridors. That is where housing expands, roads get busier, And once quiet communities start wondering how many more coffee shops they can absorb before everybody pretends they liked the old version better. But Idaho is not only its booming valleys. Large parts of the state are mountains, forests, river canyons, and public land. That geography does not produce smooth, continuous settlement. It produces pockets of growth separated by huge areas that remain difficult to build across and slow to populate. The Bureau of Land Management oversees nearly 12 million acres of public land in Idaho, close to 1/4 of the state. Beyond that, national forests and rugged terrain cover enormous additional stretches. So while people keep arriving, they cluster where roads, jobs, buildable land, and services already come together. They are not pouring into every canyon and forest corridor just because the statewide population graph is rising. Boise can change quickly. The rest of Idaho does not change at that same speed because much of it was never built for easy, continuous growth. Drive through Boise, and the growth is obvious. New homes, new retail, more traffic, more pressure on nearly everything. Drive away from that corridor, and Idaho widens almost immediately. The buildings thin out, the land rises, the forest takes over, and the roads start following geography instead of pretending they can overpower it. Idaho belongs here because population growth has not erased its basic spatial pattern. The busy parts are getting busier. A very large share of the state remains wide open. Number 6. New Mexico has recognizable cities, a strong cultural identity, and far more going on than its population density suggests. Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces anchor major parts of the state. They just do not come close to filling it. In 2025, New Mexico had an estimated population of 2,125,498 people spread across 121,312.75 square miles of land. That works out to about 17.5 people per square mile. More than half of the state's population lives in just 4 counties: Bernalillo, Doña Ana, Sandoval, and Santa Fe. Those counties contain Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Santa Fe, and the surrounding areas that carry much of New Mexico's population growth and economic activity. Outside those corridors, settlement thins out quickly. High desert, mesas, open basins, smaller towns, and long highways begin taking over the map. New Mexico is not as extremely concentrated as Nevada, but it still depends heavily on a small number of populated zones separated by a lot of open country. Climate is a major reason. Much of the state is arid or semi-arid, and water is never a background detail. It shapes agriculture, city growth, and where denser settlement can hold. The Rio Grande matters not only as a river, but as part of the state's human geography. People build where water, transportation, and institutions can support them. Dry country does not fill itself in just because a map leaves room for it. Land management also complicates settlement. Across the broader Bureau of Land Management region covering New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, federal agencies oversee 13.5 million acres of public land and 42 million acres of federal mineral estate. That is a regional figure, not a New Mexico-only number, but it reflects a wider reality in this part of the country. Large stretches of land are shaped by public management, tribal lands, conservation, and resource use, rather than straightforward suburban expansion. New Mexico's population pattern becomes obvious once you leave Albuquerque. The urban footprint breaks apart quickly. The buildings thin, the road stretches, and the next dense settlement starts feeling farther away than the sign promised. New Mexico stays sparse because its people gather along a handful of stronger corridors, while the dry, open land between them remains lightly settled. Number 5. South Dakota. South Dakota is much more famous than its population size would suggest. Mount Rushmore, the Badlands, the Black Hills, and Sturgis give it a national profile that many larger states would gladly take. But recognition and density are two very different things. In 2025, South Dakota had an estimated population of 935,094 people across 75,809.61 square miles of land. That gives it a density of just 12.3 people per square mile. Roughly half of the state's population lives in only 2 metro areas, Sioux Falls and Rapid City. That leaves the other half spread across a very large rural landscape. Harding County in the far northwest had about 1,331 residents in 2025. That is a number you could fit into one large event venue, sitting inside a county that stretches far beyond what that crowd would ever suggest. Tourism can make South Dakota look busier than it really is. Millions of visitors pass through its famous landmarks. But visitors do not automatically turn a region into a dense, permanent settlement. A place can sell a lot of souvenirs and still have very little population once the tour buses leave. The eastern side of South Dakota is tied more closely to agriculture and the pull of Sioux Falls. The west has Rapid City, the Black Hills, tourism, ranching, and much broader stretches of open land. Beyond those stronger anchors, the settlement pattern gets thin fast. Rural parts of South Dakota have also experienced net population loss across multiple decades. That helps explain why smaller communities have not kept pace with the more active metro areas. The state's best-known destinations stay visible, while a growing share of the population gathers where jobs, healthcare, and services are more concentrated. You can feel the shift driving away from Sioux Falls. The traffic drops, the towns spread out, and by the time the landscape starts leaning toward the Badlands and western ranch country, South Dakota's reputation for open space stops feeling like branding. It just looks accurate. South Dakota lands at number 5 because its landmarks are famous, but its residents remain heavily concentrated in a few places, leaving much of the wider state thinly populated. Number 4, North Dakota. North Dakota had oil money, job growth, national headlines, and a boom strong enough to reshape parts of the western state. So why is it still one of the emptiest states in America? Because a major industry can crowd a few places without making an entire state dense. In 2025, North Dakota had an estimated population of 799,358 people across 68,995.86 square miles of land. That leaves it with a density of only 11.6 people per square mile. Slope County had an estimated 628 residents in 2025. That is an entire county with fewer people than many apartment complexes. The state's population is anchored more heavily around Fargo, Bismarck, Grand Forks, and the oil-producing West. But much of the land between those points remains very lightly settled. The Bakken oil boom is a major part of the story. North Dakota's oil production passed 1 million barrels per day in 2014. The boom brought workers, capital, housing demand, and intense local growth. By 2025, the oil and gas industry was credited with generating more than $48.8 billion in total economic impact for the state. That is a serious economic engine. It just did not spread evenly across North Dakota. Williston and surrounding oil country felt the boom much more intensely than many other parts of the state. And industries built around extraction can create wealth without building a dense, permanent population grid around them. An oil rig can be expensive, busy, and economically important without turning the surrounding prairie into suburban Dallas. Climate also matters. North Dakota's winters are severe, and the wind can make ordinary cold feel personal. That affects transportation, construction, and the basic appeal of spreading settlement across already distant rural areas. People live there and make it work. The weather simply does not do much recruiting on its own. Distance reinforces the same pattern. Outside the larger cities and the Bakken corridor, communities are farther apart, services are farther apart, and the road between towns becomes part of daily life rather than just scenery. North Dakota remains sparse because its strongest economic engines are concentrated, its towns are widely spaced, and its climate gives its density very little extra encouragement. It has real wealth, real activity, and still an extremely thin human footprint across most of the state. Number 3. Montana. Montana is one of those states where the scale sneaks up on you. The cities are there. The towns are there. Then the land around them keeps going far longer than your sense of distance thinks it should. In 2025, Montana had an estimated population of 1,144,694 people across 145,550.36 square miles of land. That gives it a density of just 7.9 people per square mile. Billings, the largest city, had about 121,239 residents in 2025. Missoula had around 78,903. Bozeman, Great Falls, Helena, Kalispell, and Butte all matter regionally. And Montana has 3 metropolitan core areas, plus 4 micropolitan core areas. But those settlements remain small compared with the sheer size of the state. Petroleum County makes that obvious. It had about 548 residents in 2025 across more than 1,655 square miles. That is the kind of number that makes a state map feel slightly unreasonable. Montana's geography keeps settlements scattered. The western part of the state is shaped by mountains, valleys, forests, and recreation-oriented towns. The east opens into plains and ranch country, where distance carries more weight than urban pull. The two halves feel different, but neither creates dense statewide settlement. Montana's scenery is famous for a reason. Glacier National Park, Yellowstone Country, trout rivers, mountain towns, ranch landscapes, and open valleys give the state an identity people romanticize heavily, sometimes deservedly, sometimes in a way that skips winter road conditions, long drives to medical care, and the fact that peace and quiet can get very quiet in January. Scenery attracts people. It does not automatically build dense population. In Montana, some of the very things people admire most are also part of why the state remains so sparse. The towns sit far apart. The terrain limits how urban growth spreads. The land keeps interrupting any attempt to imagine one continuous development corridor. Drive away from Billings, Missoula, or Bozeman, and the state opens almost immediately. The next town may matter once you reach it, but until then, the view belongs mostly to the land. Montana ranks this high because its cities are real, yet too small and too far apart to change the density of such a huge state. The people are there. They are simply outnumbered by the space around them. Number 2. Wyoming is the least populated state in America, and the numbers make that distinction feel almost excessive. In 2025, Wyoming had an estimated population of 588,753 people spread across 97,088.76 square miles of land. That gives it a density of about 6.1 people per square mile. Wyoming has fewer residents than plenty of major American cities, yet it covers nearly 100,000 square miles. That gap between people and territory explains a lot. Cheyenne, Casper, Laramie, Gillette, Sheridan, and Rock Springs all matter locally, but none is large enough to act as a metro engine for the entire state. Wyoming has cities. It just does not have one big urban core powerful enough to thicken the statewide population map. The land structure pushes in the same direction. The Bureau of Land Management oversees about 18.4 million acres of public land in Wyoming, along with roughly 42.9 million acres of federal mineral estate. That scale of public and mineral land shapes how the state is used. Grazing, energy, extraction, recreation, conservation, and public access occupy a huge share of the landscape. Dense private development is simply not the central story. Wyoming's economy also rewards land more than crowding. Mining, oil and gas, ranching, and tourism all matter, but none of those sectors requires a continuous chain of large cities. A ranch can cover immense ground with very few homes. A coal basin can be economically important without looking like a suburban growth corridor. A national park can draw global attention without filling the surrounding counties with permanent residents. The geography adds another layer. High plains, mountain basins, strong winds, long winter drives, and highway stretches that feel longer than the map promised make evenly distributed density a hard sell. People live there, obviously, but the state is not laid out for close-packed growth. Interstate 80 makes the point well. You can drive for long distances between major population centers, watching ranch land, low mountains, and open country hold the scene much longer than buildings ever do. Wyoming ranks at number 2 because low density is not limited to one remote corner. It defines the way the state works. The land is huge, the towns are modest, and the economy has never needed millions of people spread across the map to keep functioning. Number 1. Alaska. Alaska sits so far ahead of the rest of this list that the comparison almost stops being fair. In 2025, Alaska had an estimated population of 737,270 people across 571,022.38 square miles of land. That gives it a density of roughly 1.3 people per square mile. Wyoming is extremely sparse at 6.1 people per square mile. Alaska is working on a completely different scale. Its emptiness comes from more than size. A large share of Alaska is not connected the way Americans usually expect a state to be connected. Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, regional hubs, fishing towns, native villages, military communities, and oil-linked settlements all exist across the state. But they sit inside an enormous landscape where many communities remain physically separated from the standard road network. The Bureau of Land Management manages about 70 million acres of surface land in Alaska and roughly 220 million acres of federal subsurface mineral estate. Those numbers show the staggering scale of land administration in the state. The transportation data explains the population pattern even more clearly. The Alaska Department of Transportation identifies many communities as remote because they lack year-round road or ferry access. According to a state transportation fact sheet, 82% of Alaska's communities and FAA-recognized places cannot be reached by road. 251 communities can only be accessed by air. That single fact separates Alaska from every other state in this countdown. In the lower 48, remote often means a long drive. In Alaska, remote can mean there is no road to drive on. You fly in, arrive by boat, rely on seasonal routes, or move through local transportation systems that work nothing like ordinary highway life. That changes everything about settlement. Roads move food, fuel, medicine, mail, building materials, workers, and daily supplies. When enormous parts of a state do not connect to that network, dense population cannot spread in the usual way. Small planes are not just a charming Alaska visual. They are part of the basic infrastructure. They keep communities supplied, help patients reach care, and make places livable that would otherwise be far more cut off. The terrain compounds the challenge. Mountain ranges, glaciers, wetlands, tundra, forest, rivers, snow, ice, and coastlines make broad inland expansion unrealistic across much of the state. The climate adds its own cost through long winters, short construction seasons, deep cold in many regions, and daylight extremes most Americans never have to plan around. None of this makes Alaska unlivable. People have built lives there for generations and adapted to conditions that outsiders often underestimate. But those conditions explain very clearly why the state remains so lightly populated across such a massive land area. Fly over Alaska for long enough, and the pattern becomes hard to miss. Forest, water, ice, mountains, then a small village with a runway and a cluster of buildings, followed by another long stretch of open land. That is Alaska's population geography in one view. Alaska ranks number 1 because its sparsity is built into its size, its transportation, its terrain, and the way daily life has to function there. No other state in America is empty in quite the same way. Some states stay sparse because agriculture and ranching use enormous amounts of land without creating dense settlement. Others are shaped by desert, limited water, public land, or terrain that keeps growth clustered, instead of letting it spread smoothly outward. Some, like Idaho, can add people quickly and still remain wide open because that growth only reaches a few corridors. Others, like Montana, Wyoming, and especially Alaska, are simply operating at a scale where ordinary urban expansion barely changes the overall picture. America is not only skylines, suburbs, and traffic jams. It is also a country with huge spaces that modern urban life has never fully occupied, and in some places probably never will. Which state surprised you the most? And honestly, would you want to live somewhere this open? Or is it better appreciated from a comfortable distance?